Greetings to everyone. Welcome to our spotlight session focusing on the latest book from Professors Andrew Herrmann and Tony Adams, titled Assessing Autoethnography, Notes on Analysis, Evaluation, and Craft. Hot off the presses in 2025 from the good people at Routledge. Our authors are also the founding co-editors of the Journal of Autoethnography, published through University of California Press. And that is a voluntary service position that is at the center of what we're doing here. Excuse me for 1 second. Hang on. Wow. Sorry.
Way to moderate, moderator.
that was an alarm for getting something out of the freezer, and I would not have been able to perform if it ringing in my background here. All right. So the co-founding editors of the journal, which is a central character, I believe, to the book that we're going to learn about. Speaking of which, let's go to the book. The very first thing our authors include in the introduction, which is titled Introduction Coming to Autoethnography, is scenes from the editors. Andrew, and this is a dialogue between the two. Andrew, this author offers a vivid and vulnerable account of living through an unexpected crisis. They beautifully and brilliantly demonstrate Bachner's tale of two selves, a criterion for good autoethnography, by offering a believable journey from who they felt they were before the crisis to who they feel they are now after the crisis. Tony, accept. Tony, this next author, offers another life chronology. They share disparate random moments from their life, and this happened, and that happened, and this happened, type of reporting style without any focus, organization, or purpose. Also, 3 reviewers recommend rejecting the manuscript. Andrew rejects. Andrew, this next author tells an important and compelling story of their experiences with minor bodily stigma, yet they do not explain or engage Carolyn Ellis's conceptualization of this very concept. The manuscript reads as if the author developed it. The manuscript would be acceptable if they explained the concept and cited Ellis's work. Tony, revise and resubmit.
Cheers.
And Tony, this last author uses in vivo to code their personal experiences. They want to remove bias from this manuscript and demonstrate the reliability, validity, and generalizability of their experiences. The authors don't seem to know what autoethnography is or how to do it. Andrew, desk rejects. And so I open with that passage because, like so many of us, I believe, let's get right to the action. As a phenomenologist, let's get right to the lived experience. But that little vignette also, not surprisingly, it's the very first thing in the book, that sets up the project. And so if you read that after reading the entire book, which I hope everyone does, you kind of get its placement. And incidentally, if you are new to the conference, there should be a link if you click on the book to pick up this great book. So my name is Keith Berry. I'm a professor of communication in the Department of Communication at the University of South Florida, which I like to call the house that Art and Carolyn built. I do a lot of autoethnography research and ethnography generally on bullying, LGBTQ identity, cultures, and lives, and also looking at autoethnography and reflexivity. Most recently, difficult stories to tell and how we get through them, and including political stories. And I will let our authors introduce themselves in just a second, but in this brief session today, we will spotlight, give flowers to this great new book. It is a book that I plan to use in my autoethnography graduate class in the fall. I'm trying to figure out a way to use this in my undergrad writing lives class. I think for that class, it might be portions of it. But nevertheless, it's quite a useful text, and I hope you check it out. And then I've got some questions for our authors, and then we'll open it up to the full room to see what folks want to say about assessment in the context of autoethnography. I do have a few brief thoughts that I want to offer ahead of time as context for our conversation, including just a little bit about the book. But those 3 thoughts or moments, to my mind, there has arguably never been a more exciting, burgeoning time for autoethnographic research. We see that in any number of ways. For instance, in the Ellis, Adams, and Bachner autoethnography overview piece that is an open access piece, That has been published 99,209 times since 2011. The classic Ellis and Bachner Handbook of Qualitative Research chapter from 2000 has been published 9,020 times as of a few minutes ago. And even Carolyn's book, The Ethnographic Eye from 2004, has been cited over 7,300 times. That's just a sample too. We have an international, interdisciplinary, and increasingly intergenerational community of autoethnographers, and all of those things I think matter and add to the richness. Second, I also think there's never been a more important time for us to be using autoethnography. So it's good so much is getting done, right? I'm thinking here, of course, of the social and political climate that so many of us are required to face, and increasingly so. I'm thinking about the uncertainty of that. I'm thinking of the violence, demonstrated and potential violence, that is being done to vulnerable bodies and beings. Something autoethnography knows a little something about, right? And so there's never been a more important time, I think, to use the great work we do to as a response. So many of us look at autoethnography as responding to a conversation, right? Offering an alternate story to the canonical normative story. An offering that says, this story happened. A story that says these storytellers exist and matter. We're here. And third, to my mind, there's never been a more vital time for discussions, practice, and learning about effective autoethnography and building understanding and overall capacity to engage in this quality work. And some of that means just coming to terms with what that means in the first place and how comfortable we are with that, what that looks like, what that does as the community continues to evolve. And naturally, I see the interplay of these three moments as particularly exciting, at least to me. There are other moments that inform the discussion, I'm sure, and they will likely come up. But I like to think about these three things in tandem as we engage here. So briefly, and then I'll turn this over to our authors to introduce themselves. Assessing autoethnography is, I've been thinking of a way to talk about it, but it's an autoethnography, but it's also a vital resource on assessment. So it's an autoethnography of our authors' work, largely editorial work, but also their work and stuff like that. So they're using their stories within autoethnographic culture. Maybe we call it the community of autoethnography. I think I see it as both. But using their stories to help us think about the larger experience, the general experience that many of us might be going through or need to go through as we get our own work evaluated or we prepare for that. So it's kind of fun to think about that, what the type of book this is. Highly accessible, conversation-based. The book is structured based off of the components of autoethnography. So the auto, the ethno, and the graphy, the autobiographical, the cultural, and the writing. Of course, writing can also include performance and embodiment as a way of knowing. It is a genre-bending scholarly conversation from start to finish. Offers us key and vital issues to learn about assessment. To my mind, it's a rich and impressive depth and breadth of research that supports it. I love that the end notes are at the end of the chapters, not the end of the book. It's a side note, my little nerd preference. It's research-based. It's rich in lived experience, as I suggested. We have insider knowledge here, right? Extensive knowledge, and that's reassuring to me. I think it's focused and thorough, and yet it's wide-ranging and inclusive of, I think, just the right number of topics to focus on, and presented in very, as I said, accessible ways to just eat up. Maybe most importantly, it's filled with different types of valuable takeaways. So prompts, lists, questions, things that I think writers, whether it's students, grad students, or faculty who are trying this maybe for the first time, can keep by their side when they're writing late at night. When they're finally getting time to write. You know, it's a friend, if you will. It's a teacher, and I think that's pretty fun. An interesting balance in terms of overall tone of the book. Maybe we'll talk a bit about tone. I think it's an exquisite representation, I'm almost done, of autoethnography as a way of life. a life that is and should be shaped by some type of assessment, our authors contend. And so for these and many additional reasons, to my mind, assessing autoethnography is well suited to kind of talk about those moments of where we're at, and where we're going into the future. And so it'll be interesting to see how the conversation goes on that. So with that having been said, I wonder to Andrew and Tony, and we might see Tony dipping in and out, checking on the other room. So that's, if you see Tony go, that's where he's going. But Andrew and Tony, would you maybe introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background each, and then maybe talk each about what led you to write the book, please.
Yeah, okay. I'll start since my name's at the top of the book. Not that order really mattered when we were writing it. I graduated from Ramapo College in New Jersey in 1991, and my degree was in philosophy and literature. That was my degree. And then I went to work for 10 years, and then I went to St. Louis University and got a job working in information technology, and ended up on the third floor of Xavier Hall, which is where the communication department was. And I just ended up getting wrapped up in all these really cool conversations about communication. I applied for the master's program, and for some reason they let me in. And my first kind of delving into ethnography and autoethnography was in Bob Krezik's summer ethnography class. And we had to go out, and I went to this little art center, and I spent the whole summer there just doing ethnography. And I had read one autoethnography book, and I was like, what is this? This is nonsense. I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think I was prepared yet. So I finished my thesis. I applied to University of South Florida. We were in Miami at NCA, and I ran into Art and Carolyn, and I told them that I didn't think autoethnography was a viable research method, and for some reason they accepted me into the program anyway. That didn't turn out the way I thought it was going into USF, because now I am a full-blown autoethnographer. I took arts narrative class in my first semester and Carolyn's autoethnography class in my second semester. And by the time I was done with that first year, I was sold on the method. Graduated, worked at Mizzou for a couple of years, and then landed at East Tennessee State University. And I am happy to say that my autoethnography class, the graduate class, made it through our curriculum process. So I'm going to be offering it for the first time officially this fall.
That is wonderful.
Monday nights, and you're welcome to join.
Wonderful. Congrats. And thank you.
Thank you.
Tony?
Okay. Hi, folks. Thank you all for, for being here today. Thank you for sharing that. I was hoping you were going to share that story, Andrew, with the meeting Art and Carolyn.
Oh, I met Tony on the very first day at USF.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. That's where we came together. So this was a treat to. I had a lot of fun working with Andrew, and I hope it comes through in the book. There's a lot of humor and a lot of snark. So definitely matches. I think us as people. Though I think you said I was more compassionate in your write up of me in the book. And that's fine. That's great. Yeah, I heard them. So my just a few key points that I sort of connect with my roots in coming to this world. Much of my early life, even up until college, I was big into music, and played the trumpet for many years and the piano for many, many years. And what that did two things for me, at least, and still to this day, when I write, I'm playing my piano all the time. I've said this numerous times. But what that did for me is I recognized audiences and with music, and I would play for Catholic masses, and I knew if I would play, fine, I would often get a good response. If I would mess up at a funeral, the audience would get frustrated or not invite me back. And so audience feedback came into a very artistic world for me, where I knew I had to do something with the audiences, and they were doing some judgment and assessing of my quality. hop into my undergraduate work. I work as a news reporter, which requires a different kind of craft, a reporting, a simplified language. I was never into writing. I didn't really know how to write much at all. I never had to do it in high school, even in early college, not much writing. Went to graduate school at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and my first semester of graduate school, I'm a first generation college student. I only went to graduate school because it was paid for. I was working 3 jobs, and I would make $100 more an hour a month if I would go into the graduate program. I didn't know what grad school was like. Had my first class with a professor named Lenore Langsdorff, and a few weeks into the semester, she had these weekly writings, and there was one weekly writing where I submitted about 4 weeks. I think it was number 4, and she gave me feedback. I didn't consider her feedback, and she replied back and said, "Why are you wasting my time? Why are you wasting your time even being here?" That was a epiphany, because it forced me to answer that question. And I asked Lenore to be my advisor right after that, and to help me with my writing, because I didn't know how to write. And so Lenore really helped me with the start of getting into this world. I had my first autoethnography class. I like to think that I might be the only person who has had an autoethnography class with Ron Pelias and with Carolyn Ellis. Had my first autoethnography class with Ron Pelias in spring 2004. Quite a phenomenal experience. So happy to see you here, Ron. Very special. In that class, we actually read Carolyn's Ethnographic Eye. It was hot off the press. And Lisa Tillman's Between Gay and Straight. That fall, I was accepted into the PhD program, had my first class with Art in Narrative Inquiry, who became to serve as Andrew and I's dissertation advisor. And we started at the same time and defended within 4 days of each other. We defended because Art had a year-long sabbatical, but that's my version. He might have a different story to tell. And then in the grad program, I took my second autoethnography class with Carolyn Ellis, spring 2007, more autoethnography. And the last thing I want to mention at USF that is a very special relationship that happened was with Stacy Holman Jones, who was a faculty member, and I was a student, and I never had a class with Stacy. And one day, it was at one of our first year orientations, she came over to me and said, will you work on a piece on queer autoethnography with me? And for her to have that trust in me, to offer that invitation, just started a relationship that, of course, has since flourished decades later. And so I've been very blessed and lucky to have these folks in my world. The one thing I often like to call this book is this. I feel like this is a second generation autoethnographic book, where you see Ron and Laurel and Norm and Bud Goodall and Mitch and of course Art and Carolyn are front and center in there, and you have us who worked with all of these folks directly, and now we're writing this up decades later.
Thank you. So let me combine questions for the sake of time. Why this book now? You in the book, and you do a lovely time talking about what brought you to the book in the actual book, in the extended version, both of you. But you include in kind of the rationale, frustration being a primary reason for writing the book. So condensing those, what was that frustration, and how does this all link to kind of homo assessors?
Okay, so so one of the things I will never forget something that it was. I think it was the chair of the ethnography division at the National Communication Association said to me one day, as I was responding to a panel. I was like, half of these submissions aren't really even what I would call ethnography, right? It was just ethnography was sort of a kitchen sink kind of place where people who didn't know what their research was necessarily would drop in. And so I saw that frustration from being a reviewer there in our own discipline. But now, as the editor of the Journal of Autoethnography, founding co-editor, I started to see the same types of things. The submissions to the Journal of Autoethnography are across the spectrum. There are, honest to goodness, evocative autoethnographies. There are critical autoethnographies. There's interview research that gets submitted. There's people who are doing coding and categorizing of coding and categorizing and using grounded theory to analyze each other's stories. Right, that's not really autoethnography either. There are people who are doing just straight diary work. Right, just doing straight diary work is not necessarily what we would consider autoethnography either. And so what ended up happening was, for me, a little bit of that frustration that I remembered from way back in the day, that kitchen sink thing was starting to happen to the Journal of Autoethnography, where all kinds of things were being submitted. Now, one of the things I want to say straight out is we're not trying to necessarily we're not trying to say that any of that research isn't good or it's not worthwhile, because there's all kinds of different ways to do qualitative research. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all qualitative research is autoethnographic and needs and should be submitted to the Journal of Autoethnography. So that was one of the big frustrations for me.
Thank you. Tony, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, and I think that we also would get dwelling in autoethnography land. There were some common critiques that we will get at the journal, and we would get at the journal, where people would write back to us and to reviewers and say, "You can't critique my experience. How dare you?" Okay, well, let's entertain that and let's see what we really mean by that. And so that was one part of it, but also to we when we were first approached about this book, we were about 2 years into editing the journal. At least from my perspective, I never thought our editorship would be a key. I don't think we were going to do this book because of our editorship, but it slowly, when we actually started working on it, we came to this point. I mean, this was last summer. We said, we have received more than 700 manuscripts and have dealt with 1,400 plus reviews at that time already. Whoa, what's going on here? And so I think that a lot of that, we were seeing some of the similar concerns and the frustrations by people. I want to throw, I think it was Leon Anderson. We sent Leon Anderson a manuscript to review years ago, and he gave us one of the biggest lessons. He wrote back and said, "Y'all need to desk reject a lot more, because this is really inappropriate stuff." I'm like, whoa, thank you. Yes. And I think we were sort of didn't know. We're learning as we go on what it means. And again, I never think that we want to control autoethnography land. For me, there are these easy ones. I think for me, this book goes after these easy, low-hanging fruit pieces where, somebody will submit a manuscript and claim that it's autoethnography only because it uses first-person voice. That's it. That's what we're talking. That's what we try to go into that space. That's it. Just because you use I does not make a project autoethnographic.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Yeah. So that's a nice sampling of a couple of the things that their writing really starts to get you to think about right off the bat. Why this now? Why is this happening? What's this about? You also mentioned citational practices, which is something that I try to wrap my brain around. Having done a decent amount of work now over time, and what are best practices for citing people's works? Reviewing myself, I see stuff all the time come through, and minor bodily stigma, as the book says, and talks about Carolyn's work, and doesn't even hint at it. So I wonder sometimes, and maybe it's a conversation that comes up, I wonder sometimes if the emphasis on the personal and personal research and the ownership of that sometimes makes some folks forget that there are conversations that exist before us and that we're joining. And it's not about the ego of the writer that came before, but it's about properly joining a conversation. So I love the way that you wrote, included that in how you wrote about it. And so,
hey, Keith, yeah, can I just say something right there? Just step in. Now, one of the things that was easy for me to pick out, because I'm a communications scholar, right? One of the things that makes doing this particular journal a little bit difficult is, it's a journal based on method. So there are people coming from disciplines and backgrounds that me and Tony don't even know about. We've seen autoethnographies from the construction industry. So it's, so in some ways I sort of I don't necessarily feel bad that, that I called that person out and said, hey, you didn't cite Carolyn's work here, even though this is what you're talking about. Um, because that person may be from anthropology, right? That person may be from anthropology. So, I've come to the conclusion that, sometimes I need to give a little bit more grace to people when they're writing. Um, in our reviews that we write together, when we're sending something back for revise and resubmit or rejection, we're never mean about it. We're always trying to get people to the next space. Try this, do this. Have you read this? Have you looked at that? Um, and so, that's one of the difficult things about this journal, is that it's so interdisciplinary. And I think that's one of the things Tony will tell you. Sometimes we are sitting there and we are stumped about what to send out for review, because we don't know who to send things out to, because we don't have the language or the background or the disciplinary knowledge to know who to send articles out to or submissions out to.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. So you get the larger context of the book in this moment, and just generally, is this idea that we live in an assessment culture. So the book launches off of Ron Pelias's Critical Life beautifully, a favorite piece of mine, and really talks about how we are assessing bodies and beings. We are homo assessors, and that's drawing off of a communication researcher's Walter Fisher's idea of homo narrans. So we're all narrative beings. We're also assessing beings, Tony and Andrew want us to remember. And when we're assessing beings, we are always already homo socius. We are always social beings. So that assessing doesn't occur in a vacuum. It is a relational process that affects others. And so that also is a big launching point for the book that readers might find interesting to pick up and think about. It really made me think about the current times and criticism. And so I have a feeling that the components will come up in a little bit, and probably with questions. And I'm really loving the conversation we're having kind of on issues. So maybe we'll stick in that path. And this is a question that I sent Tony and Andrew some questions about a week ago, just things I was thinking about. And so I wrote them. I said, the autoethnographic community is known for its openness in content and form, as a home for vulnerable scholars, bodies and beings who have been overlooked, if not altogether ignored, in mainstream or normative research and publishing contexts. Should the vulnerability of stories and storytellers inform how we assess autoethnography? I wonder, and we can have a larger conversation on that, how people do reviews and how they mentor. So Andrew, I wonder, or you're both here, like, what does that come to mind, that you're inviting reviewers who are assessing a different type of research? They're not assessing numbers. And ultimately they're assessing pieces that are often about trauma. And so I'm not making a case here against assessment. What I'm inviting us to think about is the complexity of that, given the specialness of our community and the work. And so I don't know, there's so many different ways you can go there, but what are your thoughts? Yeah.
I want to go back to something that Tony actually said a minute ago about how we will get pushback from, hey, this was my experience, and you can't criticize my experience. And we talk about this in the book, and we talked a lot about this before we even started writing. We are never doubting the person's experience, right? We're never doubting that the person went through the trauma that they went through, and that they're on their pathway to healing, or that, maybe they're just starting off on their pathway to healing. Whatever that path, what we are critiquing only is the graphy, the representation of their experience. And, whether it's a poem, or whether it is prose, whether it's a layered account, whether they're doing a representation in video form or art form, which we would actually like to get more of both of the latter, because we're an online publication. But you know, it's the representation that we're criticizing, critiquing. So it's never about critiquing the person themselves or their experience. It's just about critiquing the graphy, right? The representation thereof. And that's a super important thing to remember. And that can be a little bit hard for those of us who do autoethnography, because not only are we super invested in our research anyway, but the research is super personal to all of us, right? So there's sort of this double personal piece of doing autoethnographic research in particular. Tony?
And I would just add that we also spend so much time, and it's getting worse. And this is an is what it is, and understandable it is what it is. It takes a lot of work for us to find. We do a lot. I can't tell you. We spend most of our time spent trying to find possible friendly reviewers of a piece. We keep having this discussion. Most things we send out to review, we send to 6 to 8 people, hoping that we get at least 2 people will say yes, because often these are out of our area, and we go through people's articles. We have to find their contact information, and we do assessment of our reviewers, because we want to. It goes right back to what you're asking, Keith. That we want to try to find. We would never send. We have never once sent a manuscript topically to somebody who studies the similar topic. We need to know that they also study this topically, at least qualitatively, hopefully ethnographic, and maybe in a perfect world autoethnographically. And so we spend a lot of time doing that. And we rely on these reviews. So we did. I mean, just an example. We didn't notice this at first read. We sent one manuscript to 3 reviewers. A few of them are on the editorial board, and all 3 came back and said, "This is revenge autoethnography. The journal could get sued if you publish this, and it's really putting a target on somebody's back if this is published." We need to know that. That was so helpful. And again, there's where your reviewers align. All of them said, "I wouldn't publish this. I wouldn't publish this." You're getting into tricky territory. So, but some of that comes with their expertise and vulnerability. We do rely on, we'll do a first read and then we'll send it out, but we need our help. But it takes a lot of work to find folks to help with the vulnerable text.
That's great. That's great. It is interesting to think about the ways in which assessment is and is not different than other modes of assessment too. I think it's probably both. I think it's I think a long time ago I wrote about the difficulty of critiquing a piece that hit so close to home in International Journal of Qualitative Methods, and I was very defensive about it, and I felt bad critiquing this person who was an advocate. But I think I was living out a myth at the time that I needed to learn through about autoethnography. That it's not about if you do the assessment, it's about how, perhaps. Nevertheless, in light of time, and these things always go quickly, and I want to make sure there's a lot of time for interaction and conversation. A question that I didn't share with you, but I think this might be a helpful one. I think this is a novel book. There isn't one like it. There isn't one, unless I'm forgetting it, on assessing autoethnography. So it is filling a massive gap. I think it's a bold undertaking. I think it's smart and also silly at times, purposely silly. You'll find things talked about you might not expect in an academic book. I love that. And so it's novel, and I think it's going to be so well received and used. So I ask you both, before we go to the larger conversation, what do you hope this book does? If you had a dream for this book, to, assuming that it is well read, let's just assume it's well read and that people are open to it, as they will be, no doubt. What's your dream with this book? Tony, what do you think?
Yeah, I will go always to I love, and if y'all know me, even if you're present today, one of my tasks for years is I have my autoethnographic work, but I also love contributing to the building the infrastructure for doing autoethnographic work, because this goes right to it. And I want to do all that I can in these forums to continue to help sustain platforms where folks can have an autoethnographic voice, because that voice is so needed in so many contexts. We see this even at the symposium, the kinds of stories that we are here, to continue to help tell that voice, but also to use this book to help. I hate the word convince, but I'm thinking of the graduate students who, we get a lot of emails saying, my supervisor doesn't know anything about this, but is open to this. Here's a book to help, that doctoral supervisor work with a doctoral student. Anything like that would be a good goal from my perspective.
Nice.
Yeah, supporting each other as a community, and not just through things like the Journal of Autoethnography or through IANI, or through our various and sundry disciplinary conferences, et cetera. But I was thinking in terms of more personal ways to help each other and professional ways. So I did something that I've come to the conclusion that one of the things is that we all know this, our research constantly changes and and sometimes even if it doesn't change, we look at it in different directions, and because we are constantly growing in new things. So something I did last week is I zoomed in on Chris Patty, who was giving a lecture up at App State on remembering and talking to and interviewing and writing autoethnographically about Holocaust survivors, and research that he started with Carolyn. And it was interesting. He was surprised that I was there, right? And the reason that he was surprised that I was there is because I'm not connected to App State at all, right? In fact, in some ways, App State and East Tennessee State University are rivals, because we're sort of in the same area. But it was important to me to show support to somebody who's doing the same work that we are on an individual level, not just sort of on an organizational kind of level like this.
Perfect. Thank you. Wonderful. So let us shift to some questions from those in attendance. If my guess is right, we'll have a bunch. And so if we can maybe stay mindful of time and make our questions really brief so we can get as many in. And let's go with just raising our hands, and we're already going here. And Professor Poulos.
I'll be fast. I just wanted to make a comment. When Andrew told me they were writing this book, I was like, yes, please, yes. Because, and I'm glad to hear that they've deaths rejected more, because sometimes some of the stuff I was getting, I was looking at this going, what in the world am I reading? I think that's that kitchen sink thing that he was talking about. I love the citational practices idea, because you get like a lot of you, I get those citation notices from Google Scholar, and one was a mechanical engineering article that was citing me, which made me suspicious of their citational practices in mechanical engineering. I looked it up. It was hard to believe that they were doing this. I did want to just correct one thing Andrew said. Oh, first of all, I wasn't surprised when Keith said there's snark and silliness. Okay, in the book. But
get ready.
I want to correct one thing Andrew said, and then I'll be quiet. Andrew, it's not a journal driven by method. It's a journal driven by a way of life.
Yes.
And if any, remember the ethnogs and art. It's not a method. And I think that's a problem.
If everybody thought of it that way, our job would be so much easier.
Yes, which leads me to my last point, which is I hope everybody that submits to journals actually reads the stuff that you put out there. That's what this journal is about, right, before they submit, because I think that's what I try to teach my graduate students. I'm really looking forward to reading this book and using it in my seminar in autoethnography in the fall.
That's wonderful. I need to see that dog move, by the way, on the bed. It's like, it's not moving. It's not moving for the last hour.
Zoom is a sleeping pill for Finland.
Clearly. But thank you, Chris. And that's a good reminder. Check out Andrew and Tony's editor's introduction to the very first issue, which lays out very clearly the components of autoethnography that they'd like to really have us think about. Rachel, I believe you're next.
Hi, thanks. So I'm a PhD student at Warwick University in an applied linguistics department, and I've just been doing a talk in one of the other groups, and we were talking about advocacy of autoethnography within an academic environment, me coming from an environment where autoethnography is not something that's typically used in my department. And this book, with all of these things here, is what I used yesterday with a professor to say, let me tell you how we can help people understand why it's so freaking cool and it has so much impact for advocacy. So thanks. I just wanted to be a fangirl and say thanks.
That's lovely. And by the way,
Thank you, Rachel.
If you look at that book's cover and you move around the room, the eyeballs stare at you, they follow you, which is kind of intense, but I think symbolic of the book and their message. Sarah, I believe you're next.
Thank you. So I'm a newcomer to this community. This is my first IANI conference. Came upon it by chance, and I'm overawed sitting with the experts in the field. I'm like, what? Because my question is, so I defended my PhD in my dissertation in December. I did narrative inquiry. Thank you. And but what I wanted to really write was my story. Autoethnography is what I wanted to do all the time, except I removed myself from the process. So I think I really wanted to learn something about myself because I'd lived my story a very long time and I wanted to know if I had something to offer to the world. So now, as I'm in this community, I'm thinking about what I think through my doctoral process, I wrote one autoethnography I want to show you. I think based on the analysis and stuff, it will all be shut down because I didn't know anything. I know some, but not anything, not everything. So then I'm wondering, at this, for someone who desires to take a career path that way, what would your suggestion be? And the reason why I ask this is this. When I talked to my professors that I was attending this conference, I was submitting something based on my research. And I knew what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk experience, to highlight the bigger experience. I was told, stick to the data. And in that, the discouragement, don't talk about yourself. And yet in what I wanted to do was to make the connection. How do I transition from the interviews, what I've learned about myself from others in order to shed light on the world beyond them and myself?
Thank you for your comment. It's very thoughtful. Andrew or Tony, do you have any thoughts to respond? Or maybe we move on?
I'll just say, it's really fascinating, and this is exciting though. I mean, we can never go back and I mean, I often, I mean, even much more lately, I've been asking Art and Carol and Keith when we visited we all were together at the cabin. One thing I was intrigued with is, what were the battles in the 90s of 80s and 90s doing this stuff, which were different sort of, I don't think we necessarily dealt with those same things in the 2000s, but I think, Chris, you brought up transgressions earlier. Even in autoethnography land, there was a lot of explicit aggressive critiques of it. I don't see those much anymore. And this, so I'm going back to your comment, Sarah, that I think that yeah, we still hear them, and we still know that people say those. And Luke, I'm thinking of your previous session when people were bringing it, your professors not letting you do this work in reactions to, or where did you want to get hired? That's still there, but I think, gosh, this is blown up. If an example, when people say, well, what journals publish autoethnography? I throw it back and say, folks, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of journals that do this stuff now. You could not say that in 2005. And so I think we see it, but it's slow.
Yeah,
that's wonderful. I think one of the reasons I love you that you said that is because I think one of the risks with too much others don't get us is it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
And it can really create this kind of defensive posture for writing that might not be necessary. And so I think about that quite a bit. Interesting. Yeah. Luke, you've been waiting. I believe you still have a question.
Yeah, thank you. So my question for you all is, and actually Tony led into this in an interesting way in what he just said, but even though it is being more and more accepted in multiple places, having dedicated homes like the journal, in your work with that, and then also in this book, can you talk about the balance between, autoethnography is a space where we get to explore in ways that we don't in lots of other types of research, and we love that about this community, but also there need to be some guardrails for it to be evaluated and to be serious work. And so in being people that help with addressing that, can you talk about the balance between wanting to encourage the freedom that we get to have as autoethnographers and the way we express things, the way we approach things, the way we research things, but also making sure that there is some I don't know how to say this, criteria for success, or some way that we can ensure that there is a high quality to the work that we do. Can you talk about just the struggle between those two things as people that have influence between this book and the journal?
Oh, that's a good question. And that's a tough question. Tony talked to, I mean, for me, and I think for Tony too, one of the realizations that we sort of had, or one of the realizations that I had when we started writing this book was, everybody sort of gets autoethnography definitionally, right? You're writing from the first person to critique culture and being self-reflective so you can critique yourself. But what we found as we were doing the journal and started writing this book, I had this sort of epiphany that the issue for a lot of autoethnography is the graphy. I use the term storify, right? Storify your experience. Turn your think about your favorite scene in your favorite movie, right? And what is it that compels you? Or your favorite scene in your favorite book? What is it that compels you to go back to that over and over and over again? What makes that part of the story or that scene so good and so rich that you constantly return back to it? Right? It's because it's a compact, it's a beautiful part of the story. And so it's got to have all those sorts of details like that ethnographers talk about. It's got to have thick description, et cetera, et cetera. All of that for me is the first thing that I now look for, because it tends to be, in a lot of times, the weakest thing. We're all trained academics, right? We could write a literature review and read Foucault all day long if we wanted to, right? But honing those narrative skills, in particular, the ability to be a great storyteller, that's, for me, that's the first place I go when I start to critique, and it's now the first place I go when I start to write. Bud Goodall used to say, from good story comes theory. And I really think that that's sort of, I've really kind of taken that to heart, that it's the storytelling that's super important and is the first thing, right? And then you can examine, that in your story, those rich stories, in comparison to what society says, or what, what other authors on the topic have said, what other researchers have said. So
And you
that's
engage, and you engage with that in the book, that position that Bud had, if I'm not mistaken, that's in there, and you work through that, so it's lovely. So I'm mindful of time here. Maybe we can just quickly have these last two questions. Nabila, I believe you were next.
Okay, thank you. So I'll try to be quick. So I have two questions. One is very specific, like how do you differentiate between autoethnography and auto theory? That's one. And the other is, actually, I have to share an experience, but I'll try to be as precise as possible.
Because we are at our time. I just want to let you know, we are at our time, but keep going, but very brief.
Okay, you know what? Just this question then.
Okay, it's a wonderful one. Tony, Andrew?
This is not so fantastic question, and I love. I'm not going to be able to put any strict boundaries, and I don't want to put any strict boundaries on these. I would say that in my very limited knowledge of auto theory is that I think that you see a lot more of the author writing alongside. I want to say it's much more philosophical in emphasis. In Lauren Fournier's book, she does engage autoethnography briefly, and so there is a slight connection. But I don't want a pretty rigid line. I see them as overlapping, for sure. There was just a call for papers. I forgot what journal it was, for manuscripts in auto theory and auto fiction, and so that's another term that I see these all overlapping. But I don't want to go after any hard and fast rules. But I would say the auto theories for my very limited knowledge, skews much more into the philosophical realm, less so the cultural, day-to-day, concrete action realm. The stuff that I've read, I'm thinking of the Ahmed. Though Ahmed does. I mean, where do you put Ahmed? I put Ahmed. I think Ahmed. She's phenomenology.
Yeah.
I read Ahmed as an autoethnographer. I think Ahmed could be read as an auto theorist too. And what do we gain and lose from those reads?
And so I wanted to acknowledge that we have multiple questions in chat that perhaps you guys could check out and respond if you get a moment, and just comments too, including a provocative one I thought from Art Bachner. Very briefly though, Adeline, quick question.
Yeah, thank you. It's Adeline. So I put my question in the chat, but I just wanted to say it because nobody was responding. So talking about using the first person, is it okay to use the last name or the first name? It's something that my collaborators and I this week have been grappling with. Even though we've written in the first person before, we were thinking about, is it possible to use the last name also? So any thoughts on that?
Good question. And this is with duo autoethnography in particular, right?
Yes. Yes.
Is there a preference?
I think I just say what does the project demand, and see what I don't think there's a rule. I don't think there's a see what yeah, sure. I mean, folks, how you name yourself in the text is so different. I mean, so many people do different things. Pseudonyms, publishing anonymously, changing the names of the authors. People do that, or not, or you're just using last name, or using second person voice that you don't know who the author is. Carol Ramble just published. She's published a few things, but there's a Bachner and Ellis tribute collection that Carol Rambo has a piece with her graduate students, and does a move where they have her and two graduate students, I think, and then author X. And author X, you don't know if is real or not. And so, I mean, there's so many ways to. I would say it depends on start with what works for the story, and what do you prefer, and then. Yeah, I've seen a bunch of different ways to do it.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that's helpful.
Folks will note Vieira has a question in chat that some folks might be able to respond to, offer some resources about undergraduate instruction. I've got some ideas there for you too, and I'll send along. briefly, what's in the future, Tony and Andrew, for this topic? Are there things that come to mind? That this is a gigantic topic, so I would understand if there are none, but are there any looming things in your thinking?
We've been using our annual editorials as sort of a snapshot of the kinds of stuff we're hearing from readers. I think it'd be really helpful. I've been saying this in one of my autoethnography classes now. Is I think it would be helpful. Somebody needs to do a very, it does not rigid, but a helpful guide to helping review boards and IRBs navigate autoethnographic issues. And I've always been wanting IANI to do sort of I don't know, not a white paper, a statement kind of paper on trying to help scholars using this. That's a common question that I get. They can't get through the IRB. The IRB doesn't know how to work, or REB, or whatever you call it at your institution. So that's a project. I don't know who can do that, but it'd be helpful. A guide. We get a lot of those questions.
Interesting question just dropped in from Sarah Dykens Callahan, which I think is essentially asking how do we get at the culture? How do we assess that where it's not just about the auto? Great question. Hello, Sarah.
I mean, that's something that Tony and I write about in the book, and we wrote about in an editorial too, is the so what question, right? You had an experience, good for you, right? I had an experience, good for me, yay, right? But how do you connect that to the experience of others, not only through the literature, right, of people who have written about it before, but the larger, right, but the larger sociological questions that we're trying to answer. What does it mean to have for example, deconstructed your conservative Christianity, for example? How does that touch other people who have gone through the process, or are trying to go through the process, or will go through the process? That's a big part of the so what question. How does this connect to other, beyond the story? How does this connect to other people on the outside, right, and outside your own experience?
And sometimes, don't you think it's about helping people realize that they actually have a story there? It's not just what they live. There's a story there. Bachner tells us to find the story in our experience, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I'm glad you mentioned that. It's a great way to end because that was one of the examples of a takeaway. I love that moment in the book. Literally helping people think about ways to think through their own project for the so what question. Lovely. I wish we had an hour and a half or two.
Thanks for the question, Sarah.
Oh, yeah. Lots of good stuff in chat. Sorry if we overlooked any of it, but there's some great questions and ideas and resources. And definitely pick up this book. It's one to check out. It feels to me like a labor of love, and it's also very fun. And I think when you do serious stuff, personally, fun can be helpful in the times we're in. So it's a lovely way to work through a very serious topic, and maybe a little gentleness with it too. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Check it out. You'll see. So we thank our authors, and thanks everyone for participating. And
thank you, Keith.
You bet.
Thank you, Keith.
My pleasure. Have a great rest.
Thank you all for being here.
Appreciate y'all. Thank you so much.